So my name is Colin Price. I'm based at the University of Sheffield, and I want to apologise before I start because I have to leave pretty soon after 2, and that's a real shame because I think that's when so I'll miss the discussion, which will be the interesting bit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some recent work, in fact very live current work that we're doing about social frontiers. I've called it Life at the Frontiers, and we're looking at the impact of boundaries between neighbourhoods and what that means for segregation. My background is actually as an economist, as a housing economist, and I don't know if you can guess what this kind of lunar landscape actually is, but it's actually a house price surface. A bit more sophisticated than that, it's actually a constant quality house price surface. So the idea is with this model is that we take a particular house with a particular attribute which we control for the quality and the size of the house, and we move it across the city as a thought experiment or using these models and say how much would that house be worth controlling for the attributes of that house. And what it reveals is lots of interesting things. In a way it reveals the quality of life in different parts of the city. I don't know if you can guess what city that is, but it's actually Glasgow. So we're looking eastwards. This is where the university is, the West End. This is where the quality of life is the highest. And we're looking into this valley, into the east end of Glasgow. There are lots of ways that this image itself has actually inspired subsequent work that I've done. But the thing that really interested me out of this are these frontiers, these cliff edges between neighbourhoods, and I was really surprised. It wasn't what I was expecting the model to reveal. What do these frontiers mean? How do they come about? How can you possibly have such steep frontiers? Almost one side of the street has a completely different quality of life to the other side of the street. And what do they tell us about those social relations? Do they matter? Do they have consequences themselves? Just the very existence of social frontiers, do they actually have important outcomes? Of course, you may think immediately, when you think of peace lines or frontiers, you may immediately think of Belfast. And this is a map of, not my map, but a map done by others, looking at where the peace lines are, those red and black lines, and where deaths occurred due to conflict over time. So the concentration of violence in areas that had social frontiers that bounded them suggests that there is something important. And actually, just this year, there's been some research that's been published showing that people that live close to these peace lines have much higher levels of subscription to antidepressants and various other drugs and various other health issues. But to what extent is this an extreme case, and to what extent do we see social frontiers actually being much more malleable? What's the dynamics of them? What causes them to arise and what causes them to decline? Do they have positive effects in some contexts? And if they have a negative effect, what are the conditions under which we can encourage their demise? What are the policy intervention implications? So we have by no means answered all those questions, and in fact, the thing that's really surprised us is the almost complete absence of quantitative research on social frontiers. We define them just simply as a steep change between two attributes or multiple attributes in ethnicity, social class, religion, whatever it might be. And we are arguing that they can potentially reveal important processes. How do they come about? Well, they could be the product of antipathy. Nobody wants to live at the frontier between two groups that are highly at odds with one another, so you get these steep frontiers emerging. But they may actually be the result of unintended consequence. Historical factors, political factors, or as Schelling, if you've been familiar with Schelling's model, has shown that actually you can get high levels of segregation emerging even when nobody really wants it, if nobody just wants to be in the minority in their immediate neighbourhood. I'll skip some of the consequences, other than to say that this another one of the recent papers that's been published on this space in the States actually found that it wasn't the steepest boundaries that were problematic, but the boundaries that were being contested that actually where crime tended to occur. So our current research has got to the point of coming up with a robust statistical way of delineating or identifying where social boundaries emerge. And this is the work we've done on Sheffield. The black lines show where you've got these frontiers occurring. And then we wanted to do some initial work just to see whether there was any effect of this, for example, on social, on crime. By the way, we did this both for two different variables. We did it one for ethnicity, or non-whites versus whites, and we also did it for country of origin, UK versus non-UK. But you could apply it to any social dimension. The crime results showed a much more significant effect than we thought. So basically there is evidence, at least de facto evidence, that neighbourhoods that are joined by a social frontier tend to have higher rates of crime than those that do not. So as I say, this is really just the start of what we hope to be a programme of research. It's a hugely under-researched area. It may be significant because most of the measures that are out there and being used in terms of measuring segregation don't take into account these kind of spatial cliffs and slopes in the social landscape. That's me. Okay.
Wow.
Cool.
That was very impressive. Thank you very much. Are we going to carry straight on, Robert?
I think we should maybe have some quick feedback on that.
It would be nice to have some feedback, because actually I thought there was so much there. I'd like to ask more questions. Yeah.
Sorry, well, just a very quick one. I'm not sure if I missed it at the beginning. How did you account for different land use distributions across Glasgow and tenure type?
Yeah, I mean, in that particular model we included some of those things where we thought they're relevant, but in a way that the main use of that model is to see whether those things are what's important. So we're pretty sure that tenure, or the origin of that tenure in the sense of former social housing estates, it probably has a very high correlation with some of those boundaries. So in the Glasgow case, we weren't looking at ethnicity, that's just a map of house prices, but it probably is in Glasgow driven largely by social housing. In terms of the physical landscape, that's a really interesting question because
I meant land use.
Or land use.
Retail, commercial,
right,
residential, something that might have an impact in terms of the spread.
And indeed, the project that actually that led to that, or that model was being built for, wasn't anything to do with segregation. It was actually about trying to value amenities like good quality schooling and access to employment. So it was really just the fact that you had such steep drop-offs. It might be due to catchment areas, and we did some research on that. But yeah, you've obviously got the idea of what
Yes, Sue.
I'd be really interested to get your thoughts on how you could link your work together, because the breaking down the quality to quantity divide. If you,
I mean, I could say that you could say, or you could say, and I could say.
Well, I was going to say. This is how me and Kate started talking, really, because when we got these results and they were so strong, I wanted to know, are they just a statistical artifact? Or actually, is there something going on the ground here? And we need to go and talk to people. And actually, that's so vital in this. And in terms of the work that we're hoping to propose, we want to have a qualitative dimension in that, because we think that these frontiers will mean different things in different contexts, and they will have arisen for very different reasons in different contexts. So absolutely, we think there shouldn't be a qualitative divide. There should be a way that we can enrich each other's work.
I mean, the thing that I'm really passionate about, and Zainab and I want to do more work on, is the outcomes discussion. So you gave a tantalising glimpse of the actual effect neurologically on young people growing up. Now, the thing that I'm really passionate about, and we both want to do, is track that in relation to educational outcomes. So we've got some evidence from our existing project, that there are effects on young people at these frontiers. But we want to work with a school in central Rotherham to do that more systematically, and we want to work with Gwynedd, because I think that gives us a way of talking about space in a different way, as you say, and talking about outcomes. I don't know if you want to say anything, Zainab. I mean, I think it's that notion of actually the trajectories are both through time and through space, but also the mapping contributes a much more nuanced understanding to what those young people are kind of trying to say, which is that they don't go out, they have a vision of what they could be, but it's quite circumscribed. And those, it would be lovely to look through how they experience growing up. And then neurologically, that's what you're talking about, is the effect on as it were, actually growing and what that does.
Yeah, so one of the projects that we have planned or hoping to bid for is to use the Bourne and Bradford study and actually look at the life trajectories of people that grow up near the frontiers between neighbourhoods as opposed to living at the core. Are there differences in their life trajectories, in their patterns of behaviour over the life course? So yeah, no, I think that the mixture of this kind of, at this stage we're really just detecting as frontiers arise, but we're interested also in their dynamics and also the effect on people and qualitative and more subtle kind of cultural aspects to it as well.
I suppose there's an issue in sort of policy. I mean, I may be stereotyping policymakers, but numbers can make a difference, can't it? Because it makes things clear. So I suppose in that sense, if we're also talking about policy influencing policy, mixing these two ideas together.
I mean, going back to colleagues from Rotherham Metropolitan Borough Council, I mean, you have often said to me about the intersection between, say, Wickersley, Moorgate and Central Rotherham and those frontiers being there. And then if we work more closely with you and with Willan, we could start to map that out more. And I think that's something that I feel, in terms of your work, would be really useful to do. And look at whether the idea of social frontiers actually works in Rotherham, or what we could learn from your research. So I'm just looking at you two as well.
We'd be quite keen to do that. I mean, there's a lot of areas where very affluent areas, right next to areas of high quality, relationships and dynamics between the two. Keen to explore them a bit more from an academic perspective.
One of the interesting things which I didn't mention was the multidimensional nature of frontiers. As you mentioned, you may have differences in social class or deprivation overlapping with ethnic differences and other differences. And initially we thought the more differences you have, the higher the chances of tension or problems. But actually talking to Joe Frey from the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, his observation was in the Irish context that actually if you had a middle class Catholic area next to a working class Protestant area or vice versa, it's unlikely to be problems. It's where you have a Catholic area and Protestant area that are both working class or deprived next to each other. That's when you get problems, because there's a sense of threat and a sense of competition for resources, perhaps. So I think it's a really interesting mixture of difference and similarity. Under what circumstances do those combine to cause problems, and under what circumstances do actually social frontiers have positive effects? One of the papers that come out this year I mentioned actually suggests that it's the once a frontier has emerged, it almost provides you with kind of a strong fence that leads to good neighbours type argument, whereas it's the areas that are blurred and being contested that are actually problematic.
Can I say something? When people move out of these frontiers to, let's say, a more affluent area, what we find is then those communities, mostly white, they move into other villages because they, as we move into their areas, they move further. So we have that white flight issue, sort of thing. So that's something that needs to be looked at. Why every time we move to social mobility move up, they move further. And nobody looks at that in policy. It's just all these parallel lives, and it's the Asian community or the BME or the communities segregating themselves.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
That's very helpful discussion. I just want to say one thing before we move on to the next bit. My first response to the contrast between these two approaches in the sort of from a policy analysis perspective is that they lead you in completely different directions. So like the qualitative work kind of supports the thesis behind community cohesion, that as people mix, these boundaries become quite often blurred and life is very complicated, and looking at the quantitative analysis, it could lead you to think that there's something inherent about segregation, that it's a naturally occurring phenomenon. It's just interesting that contrast in some ways. I do wonder whether the model of neighbourhood change from Northern Ireland is necessarily which seems like these theories are driven by the experience of very segregated places. Maybe that's just something to think about.
And what we'd like to do is to map this out for the whole series of cities and understand under what circumstances are they associated with problems and under what circumstances are they not. I suppose the kind of all-talk contract hypothesis suggests that even if what's generated the boundaries to occur is not the result of the product of antipathy, but is actually just a coincidence or whatever, but in the long run, the separation of two groups can open up the possibility for tension because there's a lack of contact between them. So in the long run, maybe the social frontiers do have a negative effect, even if they weren't caused by kind of malignant forces.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We're going to move on to the next